Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. I'm Kirsty and this is Stuck in the Mud. Thanks for joining me today on your road to recovery from OCD and anxiety. As always, if you're finding the videos helpful, please remember to like them and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So in today's video, I want to talk about how we respond to OCD and anxiety and why it is everything. I spoke in a recent video about how action and moving forwards when we're experiencing OCD, unwanted, intrusive thoughts, feelings, images, urges, sensations, whatever it may be, it's imperative to healing and your recovery as when we respond with action while still experiencing all the uncertainty over these things, our brain is learning that these things aren't to be feared. We still move forwards with our life whilst experiencing all of that discomfort of the intrusive thoughts, whatever it is, and they become less intense as we develop a tolerance to them and an indifference to them. Our brain doesn't care about the contents of our thoughts. It cares about how we react to whatever shows up. So if we give it less importance, the volume and frequency of these intrusions will decrease over time. The more we practice, and we practice with consistency. So you might be thinking, well, Kirsty, I've got great awareness as to when I'm getting pulled in to these intrusions. I'm allowing them to be there. I'm letting the thoughts just hang out, the feelings. I'm not distracting myself from it because that's really important. We're sitting with all of that discomfort. We're not trying to fix anything. I'm taking action. I'm doing things, I'm walking the dog. I'm stacking the dishwasher. I'm whatever it is, putting my makeup on, just doing all the normal things I do. But I'm not getting better. And you might be thinking, why is that? So it's important to notice how you respond when an intrusive thought or whatever it is that we find uncomfortable, what crops up in our mind. Do we feel a sense of urgency to deal with that? Are we meeting it with frustration and anger, or do we just let it flow into our awareness with ease? And do we get so agitated by it all because we're like, here we go again. Why is this not going away? It's come back again. This might be the 100th time this thing has come back and you're like, why is it not going? It keeps coming back. But it might seem like a trivial reaction, but we're still giving it some importance. And that's the message I'm trying to put across here. We're keeping that safety alarm going. It might not feel like you're getting involved with it, but that is involvement, because I always say as least involvement as possible with intrusive thoughts, images, sensations, urges, anything that crops up. So we're giving it importance because we're not letting it just flow through us. And it's really subtle, it's a really subtle change, but it can make a big difference to your recovery, because you might be doing all the right things and letting these thoughts hang out, we're sitting with the discomfort, but it just doesn't feel like you're making full progress. But this can make all the difference when we really look at how we're approaching these things, how we respond to them. We need to learn to be as passive as possible when these intrusions show up. And you let them hang out as long as they want to. We can use non-engagement responses like, okay, thanks for that, but I'm not doing that today. I'm not trying to figure that out. I'm not going to work that out, and just you can hang out. That's fine. Or maybe you could say, okay, yeah, I'm not going to engage in that ritual today, and that's going to feel wrong. It's just not going to feel great because you're so used to involving yourself with it. But you'll be like, I'm not doing it. Do your thing, hang out, but I'm not going to give in to you. You can just stay there and just let that move through you. And I know that sounds easier said than done, because I've been there, and at first it feels so, like I said, it feels so unnatural. It goes against everything that we've created around OCD and how we interact with it. You know, we want to give into those compulsions to get some peace of mind. And we think by doing all these things, we're going to gain some clarity and, you know, we're going to have it all figured out. But it's actually making everything so much worse. And, you know, we feel like we can't help it. We just feel that pull. And it really is taking that leap of faith to go, no, yeah, I know you're there, but I'm not going to do that today. You know, and we can also, you know, we're moving forward with action. That's, like I said, that's so important. Doing those everyday tasks that we do whilst the thought's there, you know, whilst the feeling's there, the sensation, that urge to do that ritual. You know, we're just moving forwards. And our brain, you know, will start to understand we're not fearing the presence of these thoughts, and they lose their grip and power over you. And this might seem a crazy thing to do, but I always invite it in as well, because we're going against the grain of OCD. You know, OCD is not going to expect this. Like, bring it on. You know, more intrusive thoughts, more sensations, you know, more urges, more anxiety, bring it on. Because you can just hang out there, you know, you do your thing, but I'm going to move forward with my day. You know, I'm going to do all the things I need to do today. You know, whether it's the mundane tasks around the house, whether it's your work, I'm just going to move forward whilst you're still there and whilst you coexist with it. And it really does go against what we think we should be doing, you know, but it really works because we're not fearing it anymore. You know, OCD doesn't know what to do with that. It's like, oh, so it's worth noticing your reaction when these things crop up. You know, let these things show up with ease, you know, whilst experiencing all that discomfort. You know, let them move through you whilst doing your everyday activities. You know, feel that anxiety. That's how we rewire our brain to safety. You know, and OCD and anxiety just loses that control over you because your brain is learning a different way. And it doesn't matter that you might not get it right every time. You know, that is normal. That is part of healing. You know, we're going to have our setbacks along the way. But we have to view, you know, every time you get an intrusion, that's another opportunity to choose freedom over fear. You know, just keep building on that. You know, you will get your recovery from OCD and anxiety. But it does take time, and it takes a lot of effort and courage. It really does. You know, I'm not saying any of this is easy because I know it isn't, because I've been there. And, you know, it trips us up. It trips us up and we get sucked in, but that's okay. You know, just use those opportunities and you will get there. So thanks for watching today, and I will see you next time.